What's up, everybody? It helps if you unmute the mic before you start talking. I'm Jason. This is episode 11, season 3 of my live streams, vlogs, whatever you wish to call them. This is the episode for Friday, March 12th, 2021. And keeping with what I've been doing for the past, last week, right now, the way I'm kind of organizing things, I'm kind of going to try and keep this short, sweet, and to the point, and not getting too far off into uh, the weeds and technical stuff and whatnot. So to start off with, I feel like I have to apologize. I don't know why, but I'm sitting on several projects. I'm sitting on several projects that I really would like to get working on. I'm still trying to get through my EOS R5 video project series, looking at the camera in depth and in great detail and so on and so forth. Uh, and I have some lighting stuff that I want to do, and I'm trying to move through projects. The thing that's been holding me up is fatigue. I'm if you haven't seen, if you haven't caught it, or I've mentioned it in other videos, I live in South Florida. I train outside, and I've only got the short winter period roughly to really hammer down on fitness stuff. And so I am sort of wrapping up, well, for the next couple of weeks at least, um, my winter fitness training program. And at this point, I'm kind of really ramping up the intensity and the volume of what I'm doing. And basically, that is leaving me really crunched for energy to go into producing, significant amount of video content or significant amount of content. There's stuff I can do. There's stuff I'm working on that's not standing in front of a camera, being 100% alert, 100% focused, and 100% engaged. And, you know, I talk about this. I don't know if this is true for everybody else who's doing stuff on YouTube or whatnot, but for me personally, the get in front of the camera and present is very taxing. I have, if I'm fatigued, I can really tell because I can't talk straight, or I start saying an awful lot. There's a number of things that I have to pay attention to, my notes, what's going on with the recording, are the levels good, is the framing, composition, lighting, etc. And this is like triply the case when, and I apologize for the video dropping out occasionally. I'm still using the EOS webcam utility, and for some reason my cameras will just turn off randomly. But this is for the live streams, because the way I do this, being fatigued isn't it isn't as big of an issue as it is when I'm recording content that's much more technical, and that's much more, I need to hit marks on my presentation. Uh, and I have to pay attention to a time limit normally when I'm recording, because I'm shooting these on DSLRs with 30-minute record limits. And so, I have to, it's complicated. There's a lot of stuff that goes into shooting video that, at least again, maybe this is just me and not the way everybody else kind of works or does it, but there's a lot of stuff that goes into it, and the more I'm fatigued, the much it becomes massively harder for that to happen. So stuff that I thought I was going to be getting worked on, I'm not getting worked on because, well, quite honestly, when priorities come down to it, for the last 2 years, I've been trying to lose weight and get into as best shape, or as good of shape as I possibly can get into. And when I get into a phase where I have the weather and the ability to really focus on getting fit, getting into shape, losing weight, and doing that kind of stuff, um, unfortunately, other things like producing videos sort of takes a sideline for me, at least for a couple of weeks. There's when I'm in a unique position when I can focus on something, I really tend to focus on it. So that's why I'm not really putting out the video content that I was a couple months ago or a couple weeks ago. I'm really ramping up training so that, in a large part, primarily, so that when COVID's over and we can start traveling again, well, not over, but things get back more towards normal and we can start traveling again, I can start going places and hiking trails and doing photography and whatnot, and not just being kind of absolutely steamrolled by simple trails like I was a couple years ago, several years ago. So with that out of the way, let's get on to the first topic that I want to talk about today, which is Nikon has finally announced that they're working on a Z9 professional mirrorless camera. Now, for some reason, and I don't know if it's probably just me, but I feel like, didn't they already do this? Maybe I missed, maybe it was rumor mills, maybe it was, I'm not really sure, but I had it in my mind for some reason that Nikon already announced that they were developing the Z9 late last year. But I couldn't find a press release for it when I quickly Googled, so perhaps I'm totally conflating it, with something, but I distinctly remember seeing something that I thought was from Nikon that said the Z9 was supposed to be like the EOS R5's imaging engine combined with Sony's autofocus combined with Nikon's ergonomics or something like that. But, again, it's entirely possible that that was something that was rumor milled or something like that and not an actual announcement, and I'm just misremembering it. So on the whole point of development announcements, which is essentially what this is, there's basically no specifications provided. I gotta be honest, I don't like them. I just don't really. If you're a Nikon user, or if you're not a Nikon, now I understand why these things get done. It's because the company feels that they need to make this announcement so that they stay relevant in the eyes of the photographic community. So Canon has the EOS R5 on the market that shoots 8K video and 20 frame per second stills and blah blah blah. And Sony now has the A1. I think it's shipping now, but at least announced and on the market, and it shoots 8K videos and stills and blah blah blah. And Nikon doesn't have that on the market. They don't have a product out there. The Z7 is not, the Z7 II is not an 8K video camera. It doesn't shoot 20 frames per stills at 20 frames per second. It's, you could argue, kind of last generation mirrorless tech in some respects. And, it's important, I think, for Nikon to remind people that they're not giving up or leaving the market or something like that. And so you get these kind of, we're working on this new camera and it's awesome, and we're not going to tell you anything about it kind of announcements, because it's to make people know that Nikon, that the Nikon, Canon, Sony, whatever, isn't giving up, and they're still relevant, and don't. My perception is, please don't switch away from us. We actually are going to be producing something that you want to buy. I feel like that's the thought process behind these announcements. On the same token, I also feel like nobody in their right mind actually doesn't believe that this isn't being done. Like, I don't think there's a Nikon shooter out there, professional or whatever, that's sitting there going, I don't think Nikon's really working on a professional mirrorless camera that's equivalent to the D6, but, mirrorless, blah, blah, blah. like I feel like everybody kind of knows that this is happening. Like everybody knows that Canon's working on an EOS R1. Everybody pretty much knew Sony was going to do something for the Alpha one. Maybe not the specs or capabilities per se, but certainly that stuff was coming. So what did Nikon announce? Well, they really only said three things. They really only said three things. It's a new sensor. Well, okay, obviously. It's a new image processing engine. Again, really, again, obviously, I guess. And then it's going to shoot 8K video. And I really got to say, I don't know how marketing people do it. I read the press release and I facepalmed so hard in reading Nikon's statement about video that it makes me cringe. This is what they said in the press release. Quote, in response to the growing needs of professionals and advanced enthusiasts and cinematographers, it includes support for 8K video recording as well as various other video specifications that fulfill the diverse needs and workflows. Like, I just, I don't get it, and I don't get what's up with my camera tonight. That I'm using a different one of my other R 5D Mark IVs, and it is not liking the continuous shooting. But anyway, that's what Nikon's told us. New sensor, new image processor, 8K video. So again, we can assume it's a 45 to 50 megapixel sensor or something like that. The image processing engine, to me, as a photographer or cinematographer, saying we're putting a new image processing engine is completely pointless to talk about. In fact, I find anytime that camera manufacturers talk about their new image processing engine and don't tell me things like frame rates, bit depth, compression algorithms for video or stills or anything like that. They just say new image processor. It's like you might as well have just not said anything. It doesn't tell me anything of value, and it's not something that I I don't know, really find useful or interesting to talk about. I mean, I know there are people out there, because I've seen things that people say things like, too focused on the technology and not the pictures, but this is the kind of thing that, to me, it's like, so what? It's got a new image processing engine, big deal, whatever. I did find it moderately hilarious or humorous that in the press release, they even have a disclaimer on their picture of what the camera's, of the camera, saying that the camera appearance may be different from the picture in the press release. Now, Nikon is talking about the fact that this is going to be released this year, 2021, and, so honestly, the thing I can say to that is it's done. Like, again, I had this when Canon started talking up the R5, which they only started talking up a couple months before it was to be announced, which was only a couple months before it was to be shipped, and then COVID hit, and then that got pushed out and delayed. I saw a lot of people saying things like, it's not going to have 8K video. The Canon can't do that. They, or something to that effect. And, 6 months before the camera was released, everything is pretty much nailed down. I absolutely do not believe that Nikon is trying to figure out what the camera's going to look like. The final design of the chassis is almost certainly complete. Because stuff has to start tooling up for manufacture really soon if they're planning on releasing it in, the next, before, well, basically we're 3 months into the year, and if they're planning on releasing it before September or October, or by September or October, I don't see how this isn't going into production now, if not very shortly, in which case I don't see why there's there should be, I mean, okay, it could just be a stock disclaimer, but I don't see why that there should be a huge, or there's room for anything in the way of changes, at least to the chassis. The software is a different thing. Software can be updated, fixed, changed, modified, and so on right up until the camera's released, and in fact, right past the camera's released, because you can have a day one patch available for download that you get the camera and you put a new firmware in it when you buy it, or just after you buy it. So where's all this going? Well, it's nice to see Nikon's working on a professional mirrorless camera, but again, that should have been obvious, or that should be obvious. It's nice, I think, to see that it's going to shoot 8K, but then it's pretty clear, or it seems clear to me that this generation of professional, like EOS 1, Nikon D6 class mirrorless cameras are over-resolutioned, possibly, for their target markets. I've seen a lot of people online that claim to be professional wedding photographers or professional sports photographers who've basically said that they're not interested in, or they don't feel that 40 plus megapixels is a selling point. And I will say, even for myself, not a wedding or sports photographer, but I went or got an EOS R5. My R5 was purchased in spite of it being a 44 megapixel or 45 megapixel camera, not because it was a 45 megapixel camera. And I don't really view 45, 50 megapixels as being hugely, and I've said this repeatedly, being a huge advantage over something a bit more reasonable. So, but it looks like that's what we're going to get with this round of cameras, and to a certain extent, it looks like we've finally gotten to a point technology-wise where the frame rate and the resolution and the rest of the capabilities have meshed together, and the technology is sufficiently powerful enough to support that. So, if you're really adamant against it, buckle up, because I think this is the new normal. But on the same token, when I can shoot 20 frames a second at 45 megapixels, um, that's not horrible either. Now, of course, on Canon's side of things, I can't do a like 20 megapixel downsampled in camera thing. Nikon will probably support that, given their history with what they've supported in their cameras anyway. But anyway, like I said, it's good that Nikon is definitely working on this. It'd definitely be interesting to see how competitive this actually is in the market. It's going to be very interesting to see where everybody squares away. This generation making the jump to mirrorless now. So with Canon and Nikon making the jump to mirrorless now, Canon seems to have their head screwed on straight and really be looking at the how can we produce a really good camera. Nikon, I think, jumped in a slightly better position with the original Z6 and Z7 being pretty solid cameras from the start. However, the Z6 II and Z7 II are S-type intermediate and midlife upgrades that, quite honestly, to me, look a little long in the tooth compared to what Sony and Canon have as current generation stuff. Not that they're bad or that they're not capable of being used effectively or anything like that. Just they don't look quite as competitive. So it'll be interesting to see what Nikon comes out with the Z9. Of course, I'm very interested to see what Canon ends up coming out with the R1. Except I probably, which, I mean, it's funny because I'm talking about this, but the reality is I'm not going to own an R1. I'm almost certainly never going to own a Z9. They're fun to talk about, but they're kind of not my market. You know, I'm not in the market for those cameras. Okay, so I'm going to jump right on to last week, second topic. Last week I talked about the National Park Service in the United States has new interim guidance for filming in the national parks and so on and so forth. And I was going to talk a little more about that after I could do some digging into where all the rules and stuff come, how that all works and what their deal is. So let me prefix this with, I hate legal stuff. I understand how it becomes complicated messes of, you know, hard to decipher stuff that's almost impossible to sort through unless it's your full-time job. The truth is that's pretty much what happens in any field, really, where people have you know, of any complexity, it becomes extremely specific and there's nuance and detail. And I mean, it even happens in filming, cinematography, whatnot. So it's definitely complicated to jump through the hoops or to understand all the hoops that you're jumping through. So I guess the primary disclaimer to make here is I'm not an attorney, so I may be interpreting this wrong, and I'm not your attorney, so this is not legal advice. This is my understanding of where this stuff stems from. So one of the interesting sort of things that came up in the new interim guidance is, well, there was two aspects. One was talking about still photography versus videography or filming, whatever you wish to call it. The other aspect was wilderness versus the non-wilderness areas. So first thing I want to throw out here is just a definition as far as I can tell and understand it from the national or from the federal government, etc. And that is what is considered commercial photography or commercial filming. And as best I can tell in reading the definitions that are in the laws, it comes down to essentially anything that's done with the intent of making money. So where this, I think, in some respects differs from the more colloquial understanding of commercial photography in photographic circles, at least as I've always seen it considered or discussed, is that in most cases, in my experience, I'm, you know, completely open to this not being the case from other people's experience. This has just been my experience with seeing people talk about it in general. Something such as fine art photography, where you're intending to sell prints of the art, typically wouldn't be considered commercial work or commercial photography in the context, or in the in the context of how most photographers would consider it, and what they would consider you needing what you would need contracts for, and so forth. However, as far as the government is concerned and as far as these laws are written, it's commercial because you're intending to make money on it, and that's all that really matters. So something to keep in mind, you know, it doesn't matter to these laws. It doesn't really matter, is again, as far as I can tell, it doesn't matter if you're shooting to make fine art prints, or if you're trying to film a scene for a movie or an advertisement, or, you know, whatever. If you're doing it with the intent to make money, it's commercial and would need some form of permitting. Now, I say that vague and because that's where the rest of this gets into. So this lawsuit that triggered this rule change applied only to videography or filming. It didn't apply to still photography, and the primary reason for that is still photography was already essentially largely exempted. So the relevant rule or the relevant law covering this, as far as I can tell, is Public Law 106-206, which is also laid out in the law is incorporated into 16 USC 460L dash 6D. As I understand it, the public laws are what Congress passes, and that then gets incorporated into the U.S. Code and the Code of Federal Regulations that are the working manuals, the working whatever you want to call it, for the regulation and for the government. So the public law would actually be transferred, sort of, the laws of the bill that Congress passed, and then the part in the U.S. Code or the CFR is the part that people who are in government or in park service or whatever understand as the regulatory rules. So all of this was passed in 1999, and the relevant part for still photography in the national parks is Part C in this public law, which says, Part C, still photography. Number 1, except as provided in paragraph 1, except as provided in paragraph 2, the Secretary, speaking as of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of the Interior, defined earlier in the law, shall not require a permit nor assess a fee for still photography on lands administered by the Secretary if such photography takes place where members of the public are generally allowed. The Secretary may require a permit, fee, or both if such photography takes place at other locations where the members of the public are not generally allowed or where additional administrative costs are likely. Paragraph 2, the Secretary shall require and shall establish a reasonable fee for still photography that uses models, props, which are not part of the site's natural, cultural resources or administrative site's natural or cultural resources or administrative facilities. So basically what this is saying is, if you're a still photographer in the national parks, you can take pictures and sell the prints. And this is not covering video. This is not covering anything. And video is actually covered in the first part of this law, where permits and stuff are required for anything commercial. Now, this is one of the problems that I end up having with regulation. And it's not that I have a problem with regulation, because the reality is, as I said last week, if you've spent time like really out in like the national forest systems and the Bureau of Land Management public lands, you will find places where people have gone out there and there's essentially no regulation, and they've littered, or they've torn stuff up, or they've destroyed things, or they've gone out there with guns and they've shot and then not cleaned up their spent casings and their targets or whatever. Regulation in a lot of respects is kind of important. It's the thing that keeps abusers from abusing the system, so that the rest of us can actually go out and enjoy things that we want to go out to enjoy. The problem that I have with regulation is that the world changes, and there's nothing that requires the laws and regulations to be regularly updated and to deal with things as the world changes. And I do mean the world changes. So when these regulations, when this law controlling the photography and videography in the national parks was published or was passed, it was 1999. YouTube didn't exist. it would be 6 years before YouTube was even created, and I think probably a decade at least before YouTube really took off as, well, I mean, here, I'm on YouTube, I'm talking to you, I am literally able to sort of sit here and do things. Planet Earth, the seminal BBC series on wildlife, wouldn't be conceived of for another 2-ish years. That is my understanding. It was conceived of around 2001 and wouldn't be released for 7. So 3 to 4 years for, of that until filming starts, and then, filming, and 2006 it's released. So 7 years after these laws were published. Now, the intent, as far as I can kind of see in the laws, of the idea is, and the reason I'm bringing up time frames is the laws seem to be, as far as I can tell, more focused on impact than making a buck. That it's certainly possible, and I'm sure some people would argue, and maybe people even were arguing for this when they were passing the laws, that the idea that if you're going to exploit the public spaces, which is what commercial gain in a national park, which is a public area, a public space in the a protected public space even in the United States, is, if you're going to exploit that for your commercial gain, then the people, through the government, should get a cut, I think, is, could be one argument. However, I think the bigger part of this whole thing is the argument or the idea that it's more for protection. It's to protect the space. So if you go back to 1999, if you were a still photographer, your camera looked an awful lot like this EOS R5. Yeah, it wasn't digital, but it was about this size. And you were about producing the same approximate impact as I would be on the land with that camera to shoot stills. In 1999, you weren't shooting video, 8K video. You weren't shooting, I mean, essentially, if you stop and think about it, this camera is pretty close to being able to shoot IMAX quality video in a package that I'm holding here in my hand, and, a little bit bigger if I put a lens on it. The idea of just having phenomenally highly capable equipment to shoot serious filmmaking stuff, it really wasn't there. You were shooting, any production that was shooting serious video or cinematography was using bulky, heavy, massive equipment. It probably required a significant amount of support for, film stocks, because everybody was still shooting on film. Nobody was really shooting on video or on digital stuff. Even video cameras at the time were fairly bulky with fairly limited capabilities. I mean, not horribly limited capabilities, and certainly less bulky than a film camera. But this is the reason I mentioned Planet Earth. Planet Earth was one of the first big wildlife productions to start using high definition digital cameras instead of film. I want to say it was the first, but I know it was one of the first. So, it's reasonable in 1999 that when making regulations for what you can, or the use in parks and whatnot, that if you're going to do commercial, if you're going to do filming, obviously, if you're going to shoot amateur, you're probably using some tiny little handheld handycam. That's not exactly the kind of thing that meets production broadcast type standards. If you're going to do any commercial filming where broadcast standards are actually relevant, then you're starting to talk about, big bulky equipment that, could impact the people, that could impact the other visitors, the wildlife, need steps to mitigate. In 1999, there was no hold your smartphone out at arm's length, do a video about how awesome it is to be here at Yellowstone National Park, post it on your YouTube channel where you have 1 million plus followers and things are monetized, and make money off of it. That simply was not something that was even within the scope of the thought process of the people, formulating laws, writing laws, proposing laws, thinking about laws, or having anything whatsoever to do with any of this. Like I said, 5, 6 years until YouTube was conceived, and it wouldn't take off for several years after that. The world 22 years ago is a lot different than the world is now, and the regulations, in part, just haven't kept up. And so I think that's the primary reason that this stuff is sort of segregated. It's a part of the reason why I think ignoring the free speech, or the free speech, the First Amendment argument that was made in the case, we should really be revisiting a lot of this stuff with respect to the fact that the technology now, unfortunately, I fear that revisiting it would also mean everybody needs a permit, which would be horrible. But the technology now means that the impact that somebody shooting really high quality video would have on the environment and the visitor access and other people's experiences and so forth, is really no different than the impact of still photography, as a still photographer. So that's why still photography wasn't affected by this, regardless, and what the sort of what the situation is. So the situation essentially is that you as an individual with as a professional photographer could go shoot a landscape or go shoot wildlife in a national park, photograph still photography wise, and not need a commercial permit, as long as you're not going somewhere that you otherwise wouldn't be permitted to go as a member of the general public, and not need a permit to do so. But if you were going to sit there literally with the exact same camera and hit the video record button instead of the still record button, and then sell that as stock footage, would need a permit. Now, the second thing that came up in this whole thing is the fact that wilderness areas are not covered by this change. Wilderness areas, it did not apply to wilderness areas. And as I said, there was this comment made by the video that I saw, I think it was RV Miles or something like that, who said, I don't understand what's going on, or why is this doesn't make sense, or something, to that effect. So this was also something I wanted to dig into. Now, the important thing to understand is wilderness areas here doesn't mean out in the wild. Wilderness areas here are the colloquial use of the word wilderness. You go to Yellowstone, you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's the wilderness. That's not what's being talked about here. What's being talked about here is land that's governed under the Wilderness Act, which I think was passed in 1964, that designates certain chunks of land as wilderness. And it's the original Wilderness Act. There's several subsequent acts that were, amend and add land to it and so forth. And in the broad strokes, the 1964 Wilderness Act prohibits all commercial enterprise in a wilderness area except for, and I'm quoting here, commercial services may be performed within the wilderness area as areas designated by this act to the extent necessary for activities which are proper for realizing the recreational or other wilderness purposes of the area. So and there's other regulations, but or other stuff with respect to mining and mineral rights and fighting fires and so on and so forth. But the relevant area here is that, you know, the law does provide for like commercial guides to take people, you know, or a guide to, for hire to take people into a wilderness area, you know, as opposed to just people going wandering off and getting lost. And because this is this whole, again, commercial services, the prohibition on commercial enterprise, or the broad prohibition on commercial enterprise, and the resulting the fact that if you're taking a picture or shooting film video to sell, it's commercial and therefore it's banned. Uh, or you need a permit to do it that, you know, falls under the other wilderness purposes of the area argument, essentially. You're sharing, educating, however you wish to, you know, however it ends up, you would end up arguing, or consider classifying it in your justification when you're applying for the permit. So the short of this is, because the Wilderness Act is additional legislation on top of the legislation that controls the National Park Service, it doesn't apply the suit that changed the National Park Service. It's not a you know, maybe they, you know, well, part of it was, is that suit was only talking about the national park. It wasn't focused on wilderness areas. But part of it is that because it's a broad prohibition, I think, on everything commercial, with few exceptions or without needing a permit, that you know, and it doesn't matter if you're shooting stills or video. You know, this is why it doesn't apply. Primarily, though, it doesn't apply, that the rule changes or guidance changes don't apply, because the area, the Park Service, what they were sued under is park area, park lands, not wilderness areas. And the wilderness, the law for the wilderness areas is different. It doesn't, and this is why this is all so confusing. Now, again, I'm really torn on this, partly because if you look at a lot of national parks, a lot of the parks are wilderness areas, are you know, contain, it's a wilderness. And I, you know, I don't know. This is one of those things of balancing. Like, you can hike in a wilderness area. You don't need a permit to hike off into the wilderness. Some places but in most places, day hiking doesn't require a permit. Day hiking with a camera and taking pictures isn't any more of a problem to the land. You know, it doesn't cause any more damage or impact than day hiking without a camera and not taking pictures. And day hiking with a camera and taking a picture that you're then going to sell doesn't have any more impact than not selling the picture at all. But you get what I'm saying. The short of it is that if you're going to shoot in a place where there's wilderness, or it's a wilderness area, and you want to do it commercially, you need to have a permit, period, is the best that I can go for. How can you tell if you're going to be in a wilderness area? The best resource that I have seen, and it's the resource the National Park Service links to, is wilderness.net. They have an interactive 3D map, or an interactive map. You can go look at where you're going to see if you need a permit. One thing that makes this fun and complicated and confusing is the fact that, and I'm going to just use Death Valley as an example. Death Valley National Park, the vast majority, or a significant majority of the Death Valley National Park, is actually is classified as a wilderness area. And so there are places in Death Valley where you can go and you don't need a permit to commercial photography or to shoot stills or videos under the new regulations or new guidance with at all, whether you're doing it as a hobby for yourself or as you're doing it for profit. There is also a lot of places in Death Valley where you do need a permit. And one of the interesting things that I found diving through all of this is, so wilderness areas cannot include permanent roads, which I thought was, I mean, it makes sense. And so if you look at the wilderness areas in the US, such as Death Valley, the boundaries of the wilderness area come up to within 50 feet of a permanent road's center line, I believe. It could be the edge. I'm not entirely certain on that. But, and then stop. And so, again, making this all convoluted and confusing, if you pull over at the edge of the, or on the road at, you know, in Death Valley, where you're in a wilderness area, if you pull over and take your picture from the side of the road, you know, like on standing on the shoulder, you're not in a wilderness area and you don't need a permit. If you walk 5 feet into the salt flat that's, you know, or 50 feet into the salt flat that's right next to the road, you do need a permit because you're now in the wilderness. And again, like I said, it's a convoluted mess. And I'm pretty certain that, you know, 10 or 15 years ago or something like that, the reality was nobody really cared. Like, they cared if you were strip mining or trying to strip mine something, or you were trying to run a commercial guiding service or something like that. But nobody cared if a photographer hiked out in the middle of nowhere, took a picture, and sold the print. Now, with the internet and it being a lot easier for the government to find people that violate things willingly or unwillingly or unknowingly, because, you know, as so many people will say, ignorance of the law is no excuse, except, as I may have hopefully demonstrated here, the law is so confusing that even if you try to understand the law, you know, you're probably not going to be completely understanding it. But anyway, you know, it becomes easier to enforce these kinds of things. So, long and the short of it, as far as, you know, new NPS regs, if you're in a national park that's not, and not in an area that's considered a wilderness. So, good news, if you're going to Yellowstone, all of Yellowstone is not a wilderness area. Actually, there's an interesting question this raises on navigable waters in, for example, Glacier Bay National Park, as Glacier Bay National Park is a wilderness, but I don't know if the wilderness extents can reach out to, you know, or the wilderness boundaries of the wilderness reach into navigable waters, because that tends to be governed under other laws that, anyway, whatever. Long story short, if you're shooting, quote, low impact video, which essentially is what anybody shooting with an SLR or mirrorless or their cell phone or a GoPro is, it no longer matters in the national parks. If you're in the national park but not a wilderness area, whether you're doing it recreationally or for profit, I won't say commercially, for profit. If you are in a wilderness area, then you need more than likely to have a permit. The process for getting a permit is talking to the place that you're going to go, paying the fees, and hoping you get approved, as far as I can tell. So, you know, something to consider. So with that said, I'm going to wrap up this video. It actually ran longer than I was anticipating, but, you know, it is what it is. It still wasn't 2 hours. So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If this is the kind of content that you might be interested in, please consider subscribing. If you found this interesting or insightful, please smash that like button. Yeah, that kind of stuff, you know, the usual YouTube routine. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.